But friend, the 400-year Holocaust, white America's legal, psychopathic, and sociopathic genocide, the words that you put together in just this title alone, I was like, my God, what is happening? And let's unpack this because it's a heavy concept. And I feel like the way you approach it are approaching I'm still like in the very beginnings of it, but as you are approaching it and as I'm delving into it, just the fact that you put those words together in the title really struck me in some significant ways. Talk to us about what was burning inside you that needed this book to be born.
Sure. I think my own bouts with living inside of America, inside of white America as a Black man, and even someone that has gone to school, has gone to college. I have, graduate level education, and still having to deal with the challenges of being disrespected, being mistreated, as from my early adulthood into my late adulthood. And so I started to understand that, whether we follow the rules or not, we're damned if we do, and we're damned if we don't. Now, in my academic study, in terms of the contents of the book, once I went back and I began to study, and it happened kind of on a whim. I just became very curious, and I started reading pretty vigorously. And what I found were all of these laws that went into creating the institution of slavery, and looking at the belief systems that were contained within like the English population, the Spanish population, the Dutch, French, understanding that prior to coming here, they held very toxic views about African people. And by the 15th, 16th century, there was a hyper focus on the complexion of Black people. And so the justifications for racial slavery then became not just that people weren't Christian, but there became a fixation on Blackness. And particularly the darker you were, the more of a fixation there was on in terms of oppressing people. And for me, when I begin to uncover laws such as there's a body of statutes that are produced from the Virginia colony in 1705 that specifically focus on complexion. And so you see complexion named in 1723 in the Virginia colony. They create, for example, a law that takes away the right for Black men, free Black men, to be able to vote in that colony. And there's someone, his name is escaping me, but he writes a letter and he says, wait, so now we're taking away the liberties of free Black men? I thought that we were only focused on creating the institution of slavery, but not oppressing Black people because they're Black. And he's essentially
Oh,
saying, I'm not down with this. And so in roughly 1736, there's a letter that's written where this guy, Alured Popple, he's writing to the governor. He's saying, yeah, the reason that we took away the right to vote from free Black people is because we needed to affix a perpetual brand on them. We're doing this because they are Black. And so I began to ask the question, what happens to a people when they are given carte blanche right to murder, to rape, to molest young Black African boys and girls that then were
that's right.
prostituted to build the American empire? What happened psychically to these people? And so if you ask that question and then you look out into society today and you see the ways in which Black people are regarded or disregarded and mistreated by white institutions, by white people, and how everyone in this country has been trained to have a very negative and derogatory perception and attitude towards Black people, it led me to understand that white people are inherently sick. And they have trained all of American society to be inherently sick because we serve and we cater to whiteness, we serve and cater to white institutions, and we have been programmed to be anti-Black. And so even Black excellence, when we're looking at the schema of Black excellence, that only comes through how one progresses. We measure that by how well Black people do uh, by our progression through white institutions in every way, whether it's the grades that we get in school, how much money we have in our bank accounts. And so all of these dynamics are inherently working to continue to perpetuate this notion and delusion that white people are superior in every way. So I had to break away from that in order to begin to a journey that would lead to my own mental, emotional liberation.
I need that to pause. I just need us to sit in what you just said for just a second. Because so often, actually no, we're gonna sit. Having sat, I would take a longer moment. If we were live, if this were like not we are live, but if we were in a live audience, I would make the audience just breathe that in for a good 10, 15 seconds. We can't do it on radio because it's bad radio to have silent dead air. But I have been really grappling with the fact that for so long, when it comes to talking about the problems of enslavement, colonization, racism and its perpetuation, white supremacy, we always focus on the blacks. We always focus on Black people's engagement with racism. We focus on Black people, how we navigate racism. We focus on how Black people duck and dodge and bob and weave around the racism and how we triumph over it all. We rarely talk about what could it possibly be about this group of people who, when all humans have equal access to the ideas of conquering and dominance and devastation, what is it about this particular group of people, these Europeans, that caused them to move in a way that was in contravention to what I think the vast majority of the rest of the humans on the planet were doing? Like, what is it about them? And the fact that it is a psychopathy, it is there is something fundamentally wrong with you, and we don't often talk about it that way. But if you look out in this abundant, beautiful universe, Dante King, and all you see are opportunities for you to take and not give, when the nature that we live in is a giving nature, when all you see is an opportunity to dominate and devastate, when the world we live in is one that gives and creates and builds, but you are the antithesis of that, something is wrong. Like, what? Okay, so I know people are uncomfortable with this idea, but because we are an Urban View and we move in these directions, this is one of the messy conversations, y'all. Racism, white supremacy, it's a sickness. It's something wrong with you when you are promoting the idea that you are the best thing to happen to the planet simply because you were born in white skin. But Dante King, even saying that, requires us to understand what it was that makes them so different. So when you talk about the fact that they had these toxic views about Black people prior to enslavement and colonization, what does your research lead you to understand as to what the genesis of that was? Because everybody else was some form of melanin, we were some form of brown. So we weren't divvying each other up in terms of, well, you're super Black, well, you're extra Black, well, you're a touch of Black, you're mid-time. But we weren't doing that prior to these people getting their hands on power. What happened to them? How did they get, where did this sickness come from?
So I think there are a number of factors that go into play. But one thing I do want to go back to was your question around, like, why is this necessary? And there's an interview that I referenced in my work from 1993 where Toni Morrison, the famous and dynamic author Toni Morrison, is being interviewed about the release of a book, and she's sitting down with Charlie Rose. And in that interview, she basically says, you know, if white people, if one can only be tall when others are on their knees, then those people or that person has a serious problem. And she says, you know, she believes that white people have a very serious problem and they need to figure it out. And I concur with that assessment. I also, going back and understanding that, for example, English people had a perception of themselves that they were godlike, that they were essentially the chosen one, and that they could take adventures around the world and conquer other people who they wanted to possess, essentially. And so understanding the very affirming nature of whiteness and of the nature of, and the very affirming nature of anti-Blackness helped me to then understand that all of the laws that rendered, for example, that whites could murder Black people with impunity, such as the Casual Killing Act of 1669. There's another act that I referred to in my work from 1672, where the English actually commissioned free Indians to go and hunt for Black people, mulatto people, other like enslaved Indians, but they say in that law that, you know, you can kill Black people again with impunity. And that's also true for the Negro Insurrection Act. So I had to understand then that conquering Black people, exploiting them by any means necessary, and then having to murder them with impunity if necessary, that all of those variables were central and remain central even to this day as it pertains to white morality. And so white people then can murder and they can rape and they can even engage in pedophile acts, pedophilia, in the sense, and be able to explain it away and justify it. All of these acts sit at the core of white morality. And so you have a combination of people who believe that they are Christian and clean, that those that are non-Christian are unclean and have tainted blood. And then there becomes a fixation. Well, there was already somewhat of a concern with this, but phenotype, right? But by the 18th century, by the 18th century, whiteness is a variable at play that is baked in. And so even at the mere reality, on the mere basis that people are considering themselves superior and better because of a phenotype, that in and of itself is psychopathological. It is pathological and it is delusional. And I think when we get to, for example, the latter of the end of the 18th century going into the 19th century, the other variable at play for me became all of the academic studies or philosophies that were produced and then touted as science, that white people then began to set out on a journey to try and prove their superiority by putting out, for example, sciences like phrenology that suppose that Black people had smaller brains or less bumps on our brains, polygenism. Then you go to the science of physiognomy that's produced by Dr. Orson Fowler and Dr. Samuel Wells. And they say, you can just look at Black people. And so going back to Toni Morrison's question, why do you need to do that? And why do you need to do it not just economically, but what is the political value? There's a psychopolitical value, as Dr. Amos Wilson says, in building up one's individual and collective group self-esteem, juxtaposed against how they measure and value themselves against other people. And so without the presence of Black people, without the presence of Blackness in American society, white people have no value and they are insecure. They are inherently an insecure people. And they are, I believe, when you look at the structuring of racial enslavement and all the decisions that were made to continue to oppress and repress Black people, it looks like schizophrenia. It looks like white people were paranoid. They became so inherently fearful and paranoid that they had to create all of these vile acts to continue to oppress Black people. And I have mountains of evidence to back up what I'm saying. And then we get to Dr. Bobby Wright, who in 1975, he releases a body of papers, a small collection of papers on the psychopathic racial personality. And he basically says that if you look at the way that whiteness evolved, if you study the evolution of white people in America, that they were trained to be psychopathic in their relationship to Black people. And it also helped me understand what I see in terms of the dynamics that exist within the Black community, that we have also reconciled, and we now are in a positive relationship with this place and within a culture that oppresses us. So we are in a positive relationship with our abuser. And I think when you look at, for example, Dr. E. Franklin Fraser's work, The Black Bourgeoisie, he begins to ask the question in the mid-20th century, what are Black people doing? Particularly, what are middle class and affluent Black people doing? Because our models for progress are modeled after white people. And so he says, as Black people are on this journey to progress, that standard of progress is to become more like white people. And Malcolm X said that, Dr. Amos Wilson said it, and I happen to agree with their assessments.
Dante King, if we are surrounded by psychopaths, and I say that as lovingly as one can, if we are surrounded by psychopaths who, as a result of choices that they made, choices about the culture that they wanted to amplify, choices about their position in the world and their relationship to others, 866-801-8255, 866-801-TALK. If we're talking about people who for centuries, and really, you know what, actually pause. Because let's go back to some of these laws, because I need people to have an understanding of what it is, how this looks, right? So you enslave African people. African people who were free before enslavement are going to act the way that free people who used to be free but who are now enslaved are going to act. And what that means is they're going to do things like run away. White people, instead of recognizing that I too, when captured, want to run away, they created out of thin white air, just out of the European ether, they created a mental illness that they said we had. And that mental illness, and this is just one example, a lot of you will remember this phrase, drapetomania, which was a Black people's mental illness that caused us to want to be free. Dante King, I got to be honest with you. When I first learned about drapetomania and the fact that white people just created this out of thin air to explain away the fact that no, free people want to still be free so that they would feel better about enslavement, I was like, y'all some sick motherfuckers. Like, that is some sick shit. Like, you created a whole, pretended you created a whole ass mythological mental illness to explain why we would want the same thing that you want for yourself. That's some sick shit. When we got laws that say, as a Black person, if you mentioned the Casual Killing Act, y'all, this is where you should have resisted came from. The Casual Killing Act in the 1600s is a law that says if you are a Black, it was first if you were enslaved, and then it was just if you're Black, which gets back to your point that it wasn't just about enslavement, it was about race. If you are a Black person and a white person is physically punishing you for anything, and you happen to resist and they kill your Black ass, it is not a felony. They will not face criminal charges because they have the right to engage in any physical form of harm against you. I was reading about this case in a book I'm writing about where this young Black girl is rented out. She's not sold. She's rented out to Mr. Gwynn, who was an evil ass man. And he just destroys her physically, ends up shooting her. She doesn't die, Dante King. And this goes to court. This is the reason why it's a part of my book. She doesn't die, but the judge, who himself was a slaver, who had been known to whip Black people, tar them, feather them, and put salt and pepper in the wounds that he opened on their physical bodies. He's a judge. He says in that case, well, previously, the precedent was such that only persons who were white who owned a Black person could shoot them, maim them, kill them. But we think the law must be expanded. So now any white person who encounters a Black person will, whether you own them or not, will have the right to physically destroy them, and you might have to pay for the value of the property that you stole. That is some sick shit, Dante King. I ain't got to tell you, you wrote a whole ass book about it, but so I need the audience to understand when we're talking about the psychopathic nature of racism, when we're talking about the sickness of it, we also then have to grapple with what you just said, which is our current definitions of success is successfully navigating into the psychopathy that we have just described, and that causes me concern.
Absolutely. Thank you, Ms. Favored. You are amazing.
Thank you. You are amazing. We're having a moment because I'm like, what does that say about us? Because if they sick, if there's some sick shit and what they doing is sick, and we trying to be at like them, we're trying to integrate into that, then doesn't that mean we are also sick?
Absolutely. And that is where I go in my book, that we too, as Black American people, along with, and I'm appreciating in this moment, a book by Dr. Claire Jean Kim, which is Asian Americans in an Anti-Black World, because what she stipulates is that Asian people too, and others who are racially triangulated on the spectrum of race, between white and Black people, that Asian Americans, that Hispanics, that Blacks too, have been programmed to be anti-Black. And so even when you look at laws during the colonial period or in the antebellum South, once we formed the United States of America, there is so much of a hyper focus. I think it's a misdirected focus on the term slave and slavery, because when you study, for example, these laws in these colonies in the States, there's not a hyper focus on, for example, on slaves only. there is a hyper focus on Negroes. You see the term Negro over and over and over again. And I point to again to that statute in Virginia in when they I guess they produced another version of the Casual Killing Act and included in this body of statutes. In this particular statute, they say that no one can raise their hand to defend themselves against Europeans, against white people in this colony. And it doesn't matter. They use the words bond or free, right?
Or free.
That means
the middle class bougie blacks who gonna be at the vineyard this summer. Hey y'all, no shade, no shade. I might be there myself, but no shade. I'm just saying, we gotta self-identify. We can get it too.
That's right. And so that's why when you look at what happened to Oprah Winfrey, I think she was either at a Hermes or Louis Vuitton store, or Skip Gates when he's trying to get into his house. And even when the officers determined that he lived at the house, they took him to jail because they said they didn't like his attitude, that he obstructed justice because he became angry. So anti-Blackness is the variable that we need to be focused on rather than slavery, because we then need to ask ourselves that, basically, that once, and really look at that once slavery, the institution of slavery is over, then we have Jim Crow, right? People say, oh, 100 years of Jim Crow. I believe we're still in Jim Crow, but America has found ways to economize, and this comes from Dr. Amos Wilson. They have found ways to economize and benefit from politically from Black people suffering and pain. And so what does that look like today? That looks like us acclimating into an educational system that really is an institution of indoctrination. It doesn't teach us how to do anything but behave, think the way that white people want us to, act the way that white people want us to in institutions, so that we can go into these institutions and then produce labor, low wage labor for most of these entities. It doesn't, the educational system in America does not set us up to be great outside of white America at all.
But teaches us to master whiteness and our place.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And then if we don't do well, if we don't perform well in it, or, officials within the educational system deem that we have an attention problem or we have behavioral problems that are all rooted in white standards and norms for appropriate behavior, appropriate learning style or learning pace and rate, right? If we don't acclimate or exhibit the type of qualities that these officials in these institutions say that we need to exhibit, then we're misdiagnosed. And that's a whole other industry. And then you add in prescriptions, misprescribing, right? All of these things are institutions that function and operate, not solely, but in major ways on Black suffering and Black pain. And so slavery leaves us. Then we've got Jim Crow, that leaves us. And Dr. Amos Wilson said this, he says, if you want to understand the root cause of Black people's problems, then you need to understand who's benefiting, who has benefited past and present, who's currently benefiting at this point.
Yes. It's not fair to ask you what we're supposed to do with this at the end of the segment, but but I don't want to wait until we can invite you back on the show to have the conversation. To give us just a high level of when we have this information, we're aware of this. How do we incorporate this information into our organizing, into the way we think about ourselves and how we relate to broader society? How do we incorporate it in ways that allow us to exist here? Because Dante, I don't know how long you've been listening, but I've been trying to figure out a place for 44 million Black people to go, or at least those of us that want to go. I ain't got nowhere for us to go. I ain't got nowhere for without being the colonizers in some other space. So how do we take this information and depathologize ourselves and heal from the sickness that we're surrounded while we're still here? It's like we got to be doctor and patient at the same time, as my good friend brother Mike always says. How do we do that? We're still here. I'm not trying to be a sick anti-Black sociopathic psychopath. I don't want that for me or mine. I don't even want that for them, but they're gonna have to heal on their own. What do we do to protect ourselves from that while we figure out how to build freedom when we're surrounded by people whose freedom is built on not us not having any? Is that even possible? Damn it.
Well, thank you for that question. So I think that freedom is very mythical. right? I think we have low standards and low measures for freedom and what we consider freedom. When we are to understand that white people control all of our life-giving and life-sustaining institutions, we are to understand, we then need to understand that white people still own us, okay? White people still own Black people, and they own everyone in America, including themselves. It is a culture that was premised on exploitation, and that's our only purpose here. The other thing is the variable in terms of the question that you asked. We have to disconnect mentally, spiritually, and emotionally from this place, because that's where the liberation, at least for myself, that's where it has happened. And so what does that look like on an everyday basis? That looks like me, Dante King, a Black man, committing to not holding Black people accountable to attain success through white institutions. That looks like me not holding Black people accountable even for our transgressions. Because when I look around this place and I see someone like a Donald Trump who cannot produce a coherent or cogent sentence or paragraph, and you have a relationship with someone that I value very deeply, which is Dr. Caretha Mitchell, and she talks about white mediocrity. It's not just a reality of mediocre white people. White people can be deficient, and we see very deficient white people being rewarded abundantly over and over and over again. So why then, in my mind or in my conversation, am I going to apply or participate in applying extra pressure to Black people to achieve, when white people don't have to achieve at all? For example, the teacher, the educator, John Cochran, that I mentioned in my book, he says, and you can Google this article, he says, I was a teacher for 17 years, but couldn't read or write. So he became an educator, and he boasted about how he was still able to maintain the beliefs and confidences of his teachers. He says, he's a smart boy. He'll be able to read one day. We're just going to promote him so that he can go on. And he became an educator. And so to understand these realities and how they're functioning every day, and I see mediocre and deficient white people every day, and many of them admit to their mediocrity. They admit to the fact that they've been handed opportunity. And so we're beating ourselves over the head trying to compete with mediocre white people who benefit from white sponsorship and white affirmative action, which is what America's institutions are premised on. And yet we're trying to psych ourselves to come into some type of agreement with people who don't know their own history, who don't understand how they've been given handouts for 300, 400 plus years. That's how these institutions have functioned. And then I'm supposed to hold Black people while we're battling anti-Blackness every day. I'm supposed to then hold them to the same standards as white people? No, we need another standard. And for me, that standard is exempting myself from all of the negative derogatory speak and perceptions of Black people that are rooted in how we've been programmed to think about Black people through American society and institutions.